On the 17th of June, 1775, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Charlestown Peninsula as the first British warships began their ominous approach through Boston Harbor. The air itself seemed to tremble with anticipation, for this day would witness one of the bloodiest confrontations in what would become the American Revolutionary War, a battle that would paradoxically demonstrate both British military supremacy and colonial determination in equal, devastating measure. Colonel William Prescott stood atop Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill as history would mistakenly name the engagement, surveying the hastily constructed earthworks that his exhausted men had thrown up during the previous night. The colonial forces, numbering approximately 1,500 souls, had worked through the darkness with desperate intensity, their shovels breaking the rocky New England soil, while British sentries remained oblivious to the fortification rising before their very eyes. Prescott, a Massachusetts farmer turned military commander, understood the gravity of their position. They had placed themselves like a dagger pointed directly at the heart of British-occupied Boston, a provocation that General Thomas Gage and his redcoats could not ignore. The colonial leadership had debated this audacious move for weeks following the clashes at Lexington and Concord 2 months earlier. The Provincial Congress, meeting in Cambridge under the guidance of men like Dr. Joseph Warren and General Artemus Ward, recognized that the siege of Boston required boldness. According to historical accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society collections, the decision to fortify the Charlestown Heights came after intelligence suggested the British planned to break out of Boston and seize the surrounding high ground. The colonials would strike first. As dawn broke fully across the peninsula, British lookouts aboard HMS Lively spotted the new American redoubt. The reaction was immediate and furious. Admiral Samuel Graves ordered his warships to commence bombardment, and soon the thunder of naval guns echoed across the harbor. Cannonballs screamed through the morning air, most sailing harmlessly over the entrenchments or burying themselves in the earthen walls. Inside the redoubt, colonial militiamen, farmers, merchants, and tradesmen who had transformed themselves into soldiers, crouched low and prayed. In Boston, General Gage convened an emergency council of war with his subordinates, Major General William Howe, Brigadier General Robert Pigot, and Major General Henry Clinton. These were veteran officers of the British Army, men who had fought in Europe and understood the science of warfare. They viewed the colonial fortifications with a mixture of irritation and contempt. How dare these provincial rabble challenge the might of the British Empire? The decision was swift and unanimous. The rebels would be driven from their position by direct assault. British military doctrine favored the decisive application of force, and these officers believed their professional soldiers would make short work of the amateur colonials. What none of these commanders fully grasped in those early morning hours was that they were about to participate in a tragedy of miscalculation. The British would indeed claim victory before the day ended, but the price would be so devastating that it would fundamentally alter their strategic approach to subduing the rebellion. By midday on that sweltering June day, the British Expeditionary Force had assembled at Moulton's Point in Boston, preparing for their amphibious assault across the Charles River. General William Howe, who would personally lead the attack, watched as 28 barges loaded with approximately 2,200 British regulars pushed off from the docks. These were among the finest soldiers in the world, men of the 4th, 5th, 10th, 38th, 43rd, 47th, and 52nd Regiments of Foot, along with grenadier and light infantry companies drawn from multiple battalions. Their scarlet coats gleamed in the afternoon sun, their bayonets fixed and ready. Howe, a respected officer who had distinguished himself during the 7 Years' War, believed this would be a straightforward operation. Contemporary accounts from the Boston Gazette would later describe how confident the British appeared as they landed on the peninsula, forming their lines with parade ground precision. The general's battle plan was conventional: a frontal assault against the colonial position, with his right flank sweeping around to attack from the northeast while Pigot's force engaged the redoubt directly. British military training emphasized linear tactics, overwhelming firepower through coordinated volleys, and the final shock of the bayonet charge. Against undisciplined militia, such methods had proven devastatingly effective throughout military history. Across the peninsula, inside the colonial entrenchments, The situation had grown increasingly desperate. The American forces were critically low on gunpowder, with many men possessing fewer than 15 rounds per musket. Colonel Prescott moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and issuing his now legendary order: "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This command, born of necessity rather than bravado, reflected the harsh reality that every shot must count. The militiamen had no bayonets to speak of, meaning that once their ammunition expired, they would be defenseless against a British charge. Dr. Joseph Warren, the charismatic patriot leader who had helped orchestrate colonial resistance, arrived at the redoubt despite holding a commission as Major General in the Massachusetts militia. He refused to assume command, instead insisting on fighting as a volunteer alongside the common soldiers. His presence electrified the defenders. Warren represented everything the colonial cause embodied: education, dignity, and unwavering commitment to principle over self-preservation. Men who might have fled found courage in his example. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the British began their advance. Regimental drummers beat the steady cadence that had carried British infantry across battlefields from Flanders to the Caribbean. The redcoats moved uphill in perfect formation, their ranks dressed as though on the training ground. From the colonial works, defenders watched in awe and terror as this magnificent and terrible machine of war climbed toward them. The British confidence was palpable. Many officers had left their field packs at the landing site, expecting to return victorious within the hour. The Americans held their fire with extraordinary discipline. Prescott and his officers walked the line, physically restraining men who wanted to shoot too soon. The tension became unbearable as the British closed to 60 yards, then 50, then 40. Finally, at a distance where colonial muskets could scarcely miss, Prescott gave the command. The resulting volley was devastating. Dozens of British soldiers fell in the first discharge, their neat lines suddenly torn apart by lead balls fired at point-blank range. The redcoats reeled, their advance stalling as men stumbled over fallen comrades. Officers fell in disproportionate numbers, their distinctive uniforms making them obvious targets for colonial marksmen. The first British assault collapsed in confusion and blood. Soldiers who moments before had advanced with parade ground confidence now retreated in disorder, dragging wounded comrades down the slope while colonial cheers rang from the fortifications. General Howe found himself standing virtually alone at one point, surrounded by the bodies of his staff officers. According to documentation preserved in British military archives, Howe would later write that the scene was unlike anything he had witnessed in decades of military service. The tall grass through which his troops had advanced was now trampled and stained crimson, littered with wounded men crying for assistance. British casualties from this first assault were staggering. Entire companies had been effectively destroyed, their ranks reduced by half or more in a matter of minutes. The colonial advantage of firing from behind fortifications at targets advancing uphill through open ground had proven decisive. Moreover, American marksmen, many of whom had learned to shoot hunting in the New England wilderness, demonstrated a level of accuracy that shocked their opponents. British officers, recognizing that their troops could not withstand such murderous fire, ordered a withdrawal to regroup. Inside the American redoubt, the mood was cautiously optimistic but increasingly desperate. The defenders had repulsed professional soldiers, something many had thought impossible. However, their ammunition situation had become critical. Men were searching the pockets of wounded comrades for cartridges, and some militiamen were already down to their last few rounds. Colonel Prescott sent urgent messages to Cambridge requesting powder and reinforcements, but the colonial supply system was chaotic at best. Some militia units on Bunker Hill, hearing the intensity of the fighting, refused to advance to the more exposed position on Breed's Hill. General Howe, his uniform scorched by near misses and spattered with the blood of fallen soldiers, reorganized his forces for a second attempt. This attack, launched around 4 o'clock, modified the British approach slightly. Artillery was brought forward, though much of it had been supplied with the wrong caliber shot, a logistics failure that would prove costly, and the redcoats advanced in deeper formations designed to absorb casualties while maintaining momentum. The tactical adjustment made little difference. Once again, the colonials held their fire until the British reached killing range, and once again their volley tore through the advancing ranks with horrible efficiency. The second repulse was even more demoralizing than the first. British soldiers, among the best-trained infantry in the world, began to show signs of wavering. These were men accustomed to victory, soldiers who had broken French lines and scattered Spanish formations. Now they faced farmers and shopkeepers who refused to break, who fought with a determination that bordered on fanatical. Sergeant Roger Lamb of the 9th Regiment, whose memoirs provide valuable contemporary insight into the battle, described the colonial fire as a continuous sheet of flame. The psychological impact on the British troops was profound. They were being asked to march repeatedly into what appeared to be certain death. Back in Boston, General Gage watched the battle through his telescope with growing concern. The rebels were supposed to have scattered at the first sight of disciplined British infantry. Instead, they were inflicting casualties at a rate that threatened to destroy the effectiveness of his entire Boston garrison. He dispatched additional troops, including fresh Marine battalions, to reinforce Howe's battered command. The determination to take the position had become a matter of British military honor. To withdraw now would hand the colonials a propaganda victory of incalculable value. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, General Howe prepared for a third assault, but his approach had changed fundamentally. The previous attacks had been conducted according to European military convention, with soldiers advancing in line while carrying full field packs weighing upwards of 60 pounds. For this final attempt, Howe ordered his men to shed their packs entirely, carrying only their muskets, ammunition, and bayonets. More significantly, he adjusted the tactical objective. Rather than attempting another frontal assault against the redoubt's strongest face, British forces would concentrate their attack on the left flank of the colonial position, where the defensive works were weakest. The British artillery, having finally been supplied with appropriate ammunition, began a systematic bombardment of Charlestown village. The town had provided cover for colonial snipers who had been harassing the British flanks throughout the battle. Admiral Graves authorized the use of heated shot, cannonballs fired red-hot from specially designed furnaces, and soon Charlestown was ablaze. The fire created an enormous pillar of smoke visible for miles, and the destruction of the civilian settlement sent a clear message about British resolve. This would be total war, with no quarter given to those who resisted the crown. Inside the colonial redoubt, the situation had reached a critical point. Ammunition was virtually exhausted, with most defenders down to a single round, or none at all. Prescott faced an agonizing decision: order a retreat while his men could still withdraw in relative order, or remain in position and risk annihilation. Reports from observers indicated that British reinforcements were still arriving, meaning the next assault would be even more overwhelming than the previous attacks. The rail fence position to the left of the redoubt, defended by New Hampshire troops under Colonel John Stark, had held magnificently, but was also running critically low on powder. At approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the third British assault commenced. This time, the Redcoats moved with grim determination rather than parade ground elegance. They had learned bitter lessons about colonial marksmanship and the futility of maintaining perfect formations under such fire. The attacking columns advanced more rapidly, accepting disorder in exchange for speed, focusing on reaching the colonial works before the defenders could deliver more than 1 or 2 volleys. General Clinton, who had crossed from Boston to personally participate in the assault, helped rally wavering units and drove them forward. The concentrated British attack struck the weakest point in the colonial line with overwhelming force. The defenders, unable to deliver sustained fire due to ammunition shortages, found themselves quickly overrun. British soldiers, maddened by their previous losses and fighting with desperate courage, surged over the earthworks. The battle devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat, with muskets used as clubs and stones thrown as weapons. The colonials, lacking bayonets, were at a severe disadvantage in close-quarters fighting. Prescott, recognizing that his position was untenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal. The retreat from Breed's Hill became chaotic as colonial forces streamed back toward Bunker Hill and the Charlestown Neck, the narrow strip of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland. British artillery subjected the fleeing colonials to murderous fire, and the redcoats, finally able to exact revenge for their earlier defeats, pursued with vengeful determination. It was during this retreat that Dr. Joseph Warren fell, struck by a musket ball that killed him instantly. His death devastated the Patriot cause, removing one of its most eloquent and courageous leaders. British soldiers, recognizing his body by his fine clothing, reportedly subjected it to mutilation as an act of revenge and disrespect, a war crime that would harden colonial attitudes toward reconciliation. As twilight descended on the Charlestown Peninsula on that 17th of June, 1775, the true cost of the day's fighting became horrifyingly apparent. British soldiers, now in complete control of the colonial fortifications, began the grim task of collecting their wounded and counting their dead. What they discovered would shock the British High Command and send ripples of concern all the way to London. The butcher's bill for this single afternoon's work was unlike anything British forces had experienced in recent memory. Official British casualty returns, compiled in the days following the battle and preserved in the Colonial Office records in London, revealed a catastrophe of staggering proportions. Of the approximately 2,200 British troops engaged, over 1,000 had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate exceeding 45%. Among the dead were 92 soldiers killed outright on the field, with another 19 dying of wounds in the subsequent days. The wounded numbered over 828 men, many of whom would never return to duty due to the severity of their injuries. These were not the losses of a prolonged campaign, but of a single afternoon's battle, lasting less than 3 hours of actual combat. The officer corps had been devastated beyond all proportion to their numbers. British military tradition required officers to lead from the front, to personally inspire their men by example. At Bunker Hill, this tradition had proven fatal. 92 officers had fallen as casualties, with 19 killed outright. General Howe himself, who had led multiple charges personally, lost every single member of his immediate staff. The 52nd Regiment of Foot ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit, having suffered over 80% casualties. Contemporary accounts from the Boston Evening Post described field hospitals overwhelmed with wounded men, surgeons working by lamplight through the night, attempting amputations and extracting musket balls from shattered limbs. In contrast, colonial casualties, while significant, were remarkably light considering the eventual British victory. Estimates placed American losses at approximately 450 men killed, wounded, or captured. Among the dead were 140 Patriot soldiers, including the irreplaceable Dr. Joseph Warren. The proportional difference in casualties told a story that transcended the technical British victory. The colonial militia had fought with effectiveness that belied their amateur status, inflicting devastating losses on professional soldiers, while maintaining defensive positions for over 2 hours under sustained attack. The tactical lessons of Bunker Hill were immediately clear to both sides, though their strategic interpretations differed dramatically. The British had learned that colonial militia, when properly led and fighting from prepared positions, could match or exceed the combat effectiveness of regular troops. The myth of colonial cowardice, that Americans would flee at the sight of disciplined British infantry, had been shattered in blood on the slopes of Breed's Hill. General Gage's reports to London reflected deep concern about the fighting qualities of the rebels and the inadequate size of British forces in North America to suppress the growing rebellion. For their part, the colonials drew profound encouragement from the battle despite their tactical defeat. They had been driven from the field, true, but they had made the British pay an astronomical price for a strategically insignificant position. The psychological impact on American morale was immeasurable. Throughout the colonies, news of Bunker Hill was received not as a defeat, but as validation that ordinary citizens could stand against the world's premier military power. The Pennsylvania Journal and other colonial newspapers published detailed accounts emphasizing British casualties and colonial valor, transforming a tactical reverse into a strategic victory for the Patriot cause. In the weeks following the Battle of Bunker Hill, the strategic landscape of the American rebellion underwent a fundamental transformation. British military planners in London, receiving General Gage's dispatches detailing the horrific casualty figures, began to reassess their entire approach to suppressing the colonial uprising. The battle had demonstrated that the conflict would not be resolved through a few sharp engagements, followed by colonial capitulation. This would be a long, bloody war requiring far more resources than initially anticipated. King George III and his ministers faced an uncomfortable reality. The British Army in Boston, despite its technical victory, was now effectively besieged. The colonials had withdrawn only as far as Cambridge and the surrounding high ground, maintaining their encirclement of the city. British forces, bloodied and demoralized by their casualties at Bunker Hill, made no effort to break this siege. General Gage, whose reputation had suffered severely, would be recalled to London by October of 1775, replaced by General Howe, who inherited an increasingly untenable position. The British garrison consumed supplies at an alarming rate while contributing nothing to the suppression of rebellion in the broader colonies. From a military logistics perspective, Bunker Hill highlighted critical weaknesses in British operational planning. The artillery ammunition confusion that had provided defenders with several minutes of respite during the battle was symptomatic of larger supply chain problems. British forces in North America were dependent on shipments from England that required months to arrive, making adaptation to colonial tactics frustratingly slow. The Colonial Office, examining after-action reports, recognized that waging war across 3,000 miles of ocean against an increasingly hostile population would strain even Britain's substantial resources. The propaganda value of Bunker Hill for the American cause cannot be overstated. Throughout the 13 colonies, Patriot committees of correspondence distributed accounts of the battle that emphasized colonial courage and British brutality. The burning of Charlestown, the reported mutilation of Dr. Warren's body, and the staggering British casualty figures all served to harden attitudes against reconciliation. Moderates who had hoped for peaceful resolution found their positions undermined by evidence that the British intended to wage total war against colonial resistance. According to historical documents preserved in the Library of Congress, recruitment for the Continental Army, which had been officially authorized by the Continental Congress just days before the battle, surged in Bunker Hill's aftermath. General George Washington, who assumed command of the Continental Army at Cambridge on the 2nd of July, 1775, found the Army's morale surprisingly high despite the technical defeat. The soldiers who had fought at Bunker Hill possessed a confidence that their own abilities that would prove crucial in sustaining the rebellion through subsequent defeats. Washington, a veteran of frontier warfare during the French and Indian War, immediately recognized both the strengths and weaknesses revealed by the battle. His correspondence from this period, particularly letters to the Continental Congress, emphasized the desperate need for gunpowder, proper military organization, and standardized training. The battle also influenced British strategic thinking in ways that would shape the entire war. The devastating casualties convinced British commanders that frontal assaults against prepared colonial positions were prohibitively expensive. Future British strategy would emphasize maneuver, naval power, and attempts to leverage loyalist support within the colonies, rather than direct confrontation with entrenched rebel forces. This shift would lead to the British evacuation of Boston in March of 1776, and a reorientation of operations toward New York and the southern colonies, where loyalist sentiment was believed to be stronger. The human cost of Bunker Hill extended far beyond the cold statistics of casualty returns. In homes throughout Massachusetts and the other colonies, families received devastating news of sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return. The battle had created hundreds of widows and orphans in a single afternoon, concentrating grief in communities that were already strained by economic disruption and political upheaval. The personal tragedies of June 17th would ripple through colonial society for generations, creating a legacy of sacrifice that would be invoked repeatedly to sustain commitment to independence. The death of Dr. Joseph Warren resonated with particular force throughout the Patriot movement. Warren had been more than a military leader. He was an intellectual architect of resistance, a man whose medical practice had brought him into contact with all levels of Boston society. His funeral, conducted after the British eventually returned his body under a flag of truce, became a moment of collective mourning and renewed dedication to the cause for which he died. Contemporary accounts from attendees described Paul Revere, the silversmith and fellow patriot, identifying Warren's body by dental work he had performed. The image of this identification became a powerful symbol of how intimately connected the revolutionary leadership was to the broader community. For British soldiers who survived the battle, the psychological trauma was profound and long-lasting. Letters home from officers and enlisted men alike described the horror of repeatedly advancing into colonial fire, of watching comrades fall in windrows, of the desperate final assault when discipline nearly broke under the strain. Lieutenant William Fielding of the 4th Regiment wrote to his family that he had emerged from the battle unscathed physically, but would never again view colonial militia with anything resembling contempt. Such sentiments, shared across the British officer corps, fundamentally altered the military's attitude toward the conflict and its opponents. The wounded from both sides faced agonizing ordeals in an era when medical science could do little for catastrophic injuries. Amputation was the standard treatment for shattered limbs, performed without anesthesia, beyond liberal doses of rum. Infection claimed many who survived the initial surgery, as doctors understood nothing of germ theory or antiseptic technique. The primitive field hospitals established in Boston churches and Cambridge homes became charnel houses where men died slowly of wounds that modern medicine could easily treat. The suffering of these wounded soldiers, visible to their communities, served as a constant reminder of the war's terrible cost. Colonial society was forced to confront the reality that rebellion would require sustained sacrifice from every family and community. The militia system, which had seemed adequate for local defense, proved woefully insufficient for sustained military operations. Men who fought at Bunker Hill had done so as members of local militia companies, many of which dissolved after the battle as farmers needed to return to their fields. The Continental Congress and colonial assemblies began implementing longer enlistment terms and more systematic recruitment, transforming the rebellion from a spontaneous uprising into an organized military resistance capable of opposing British regular forces. In Britain itself, news of Bunker Hill arrived in late July and provoked intense political debate. Opposition politicians, particularly Whigs who had sympathized with American grievances, seized upon the casualty figures to argue that the government's policy of coercion was both immoral and impractical. Edmund Burke, speaking in Parliament, characterized the battle as evidence that Britain faced not a mere rebellion, but a national resistance that would require genocidal violence to suppress. His warnings were dismissed by the government majority, but events would ultimately vindicate his assessment. The battle marked a point of no return in the breakdown of the British Empire's first iteration. The Battle of Bunker Hill functioned as an intensive and bloody education for both British and American military leadership, teaching lessons that would fundamentally shape combat operations throughout the Revolutionary War. For the Continental Army, the engagement demonstrated that colonial soldiers, despite their lack of formal military training, possessed inherent advantages that could offset British superiority in discipline and equipment. The key was leveraging those advantages through appropriate tactics and terrain. Colonel William Prescott's defensive preparations became a template for American military engineering throughout the war. His decision to construct a redoubt on Breed's Hill, rather than the more defensible but less threatening Bunker Hill, showed an instinct for aggressive positioning that would characterize American strategy. The earthwork fortifications, thrown up in a single night with simple tools, had proven remarkably effective at protecting defenders while providing stable firing platforms. Future Continental Army positions at places like Dorchester Heights and White Plains would reflect the lessons learned about the importance of prepared defenses. The American emphasis on marksmanship, born of necessity due to ammunition shortages, had proven devastatingly effective against British formations. Colonial soldiers, many of whom had learned to shoot as hunters, fired as individuals aiming at specific targets rather than as part of coordinated volleys firing into general target areas. This difference in approach meant that American fire was often more accurate, even if it lacked the psychological impact of a perfectly synchronized British volley. The Continental Army would institutionalize marksmanship training, creating a military culture that valued individual shooting skill over European-style volley fire. British tactical evolution following Bunker Hill was equally significant, though it required overcoming deeply ingrained military traditions. The catastrophic officer casualties had demonstrated the vulnerability of leading from the front when facing accurate defensive fire. British commanders began adopting more cautious approaches, using light infantry and irregular forces as screens for regular formations, and showing greater willingness to maneuver around defensive positions rather than attempting frontal assaults. These tactical adjustments would be evident in subsequent engagements like the Battle of Long Island, where Howe's flanking maneuver avoided the direct assault that had proven so costly at Bunker Hill. The ammunition crisis that nearly led to colonial disaster before British forces finally overran the redoubt highlighted logistical challenges that would plague the Continental Army throughout the war. George Washington's correspondence during the Siege of Boston reveals his near obsession with securing adequate gunpowder supplies. The Continental Congress established committees to encourage domestic powder production and organize importation from Europe, particularly France. The ammunition shortages at Bunker Hill had demonstrated that patriotic enthusiasm alone could not sustain military operations. The rebellion required an industrial and logistical infrastructure capable of supporting armies in the field. British military leadership underwent a philosophical transformation in assessing colonial military capabilities. Pre-battle assumptions about colonial cowardice and military incompetence, assumptions that had informed British policy since the French and Indian War, were comprehensively disproven by events on Breed's Hill. Intelligence assessments sent to London began characterizing American forces as formidable opponents who required careful tactical handling. This reassessment influenced British strategic planning, leading to greater emphasis on exploiting colonial political divisions and leveraging loyalist support rather than relying exclusively on military force to crush the rebellion. The Battle of Bunker Hill transcended its immediate military significance to become a foundational myth in American national consciousness. Within months of the engagement, colonial propagandists had transformed a tactical defeat into a moral victory, a narrative that would persist through the eventual American triumph and into the formation of national identity. The story of farmers and tradesmen standing against professional British soldiers, exacting a terrible price for their eventual displacement, perfectly embodied the revolutionary spirit that sustained American independence movements. Historical commemoration of the battle began remarkably quickly, even before the Revolutionary War concluded. The Provincial Congress of Massachusetts declared June 17th as a day of remembrance, and survivors of the battle formed veterans associations that kept the memory alive through annual gatherings. The Bunker Hill Monument Association, established in 1823, raised funds to construct the granite obelisk that still stands on Breed's Hill, completed in 1843. Daniel Webster's oration at the monument's dedication became one of the 19th century's most famous speeches, explicitly linking the battle to American exceptionalism and national destiny. The strategic consequences of Bunker Hill extended far beyond the immediate siege of Boston. The battle's casualty ratios convinced Britain's potential European rivals, particularly France, that the American rebellion might succeed with appropriate support. French military observers noted that colonial forces had demonstrated both the will and capability to inflict unacceptable losses on British regulars, suggesting that French intervention might tip the strategic balance decisively. This assessment would ultimately lead to the French alliance formalized in 1778, without which American independence would likely have failed. Historical scholarship on Bunker Hill has evolved considerably across generations, reflecting changing interpretations of the Revolutionary War itself. Early nationalist historians portrayed the battle as evidence of inherent American military superiority and moral righteousness. Later revisionist scholars emphasized the role of British tactical incompetence and the near-run nature of the colonial defense, which came within minutes of complete collapse. Modern historiography has developed more nuanced perspectives, recognizing both the contingent nature of the battle's outcome and its genuine significance as a moment when ordinary colonists demonstrated their willingness to die for political principles. The battle also established precedents for how Americans would remember and commemorate military sacrifice. The mythology surrounding Bunker Hill, particularly the whites of their eyes quotation and the heroic death of Dr. Joseph Warren, created templates for how subsequent American military engagements would be memorialized. The emphasis on individual courage, the valorization of citizen soldiers, and the narrative of virtuous defenders fighting against overwhelming odds became recurring themes in American military memory from the Civil War through modern conflicts. For the participants who survived, Bunker Hill remained a defining moment of their lives. Veterans carried physical and psychological scars for decades, and many leveraged their service into political careers during the early Republic. The Society of the Cincinnati, established after the war as an association of Continental Army officers, included Bunker Hill survivors among its most prestigious members. These men served as living links to the revolutionary generation, their presence at public events a reminder of the sacrifices that had purchased American independence. The battle's legacy also includes cautionary lessons about the costs of political intransigence. The British government's refusal to seriously engage with colonial grievances before 1775 had created conditions where violent confrontation became inevitable. Bunker Hill represented a point where compromise became impossible, where blood spilled had created obligations and hatreds that could not be easily reconciled. This dynamic, where initial conflicts create momentum toward total war, would be repeated in American history, most notably in the secession crisis that led to the Civil War. In the final analysis, the Battle of Bunker Hill on that 17th day of June in 1775 was simultaneously a British victory and a colonial triumph. The Redcoats held the field when fighting ceased, but at such cost that their strategic position had actually worsened. The colonials had retreated, but with confidence that they could contest British military power on equal terms. In the smoke and blood of that afternoon was born the realization, on both sides, that this conflict would be long, bitter, and transformative. The rebellion that had begun with scattered skirmishes at Lexington and Concord had become a full-scale war, and that war would ultimately birth a new nation, founded on principles of self-governance and human liberty. The casualties of Bunker Hill had not died in vain. They had purchased with their blood the possibility of American independence, a possibility that would become reality 7 years hence on the fields of Yorktown.